So, sequence generation. This is the second to last lecture of this semester. And the last one actually is sort of already synthesis. And it's sort of a critical element of DFT, quite advanced in a way. And sort of that connects a lot of things that we've talked about. It's understanding, this is the mathematical details of this are, I don't know, not rocket science, but it's a little more advanced. It's also not something that I expect you to necessarily understand in all detail, but it is conceptually is very important. So it's central observation is that sequences of states or mental states or physical states, which would be actions, are fundamental to everything. Every behavior, every thought, train of thought, as we say, consists of a sequence of states or a sequence of state changes, which are called actions, sometimes or acts. So when I'm speaking right now, I'm doing a sequence of things, I'm a sequence of articulatory states to speak, mental states, to figure out what sentences to produce, to gestures, I do eye movements. All of these are sequences of things. And some of them would be somewhat fixed and routine. So, for instance, I really don't have to think in detail about my speech articulatory sequences. They are highly automatic and learned. And in childhood, you learn that. And if you speak a foreign language, you always have a little bit of an accent because you don't quite get the articulatory apparatus to do the right thing. But then there are other things that are potentially very flexible. When we're speaking and thinking and problem solving, we're presumably doing sequences, and some of these sequences we do the first time. I've been teaching this course for a long time, so maybe some of my sentences are very reproducible. But in principle, I can produce a new sentence, all the time, and so can you. So that's an interesting problem in that it being so central. And so far, I don't think we've really addressed it. And it's a real issue, actually, in connections thinking. Historically, the insight that the sequential order, something called serial order of states and so on, is some particular dimension, extra dimension of thought and of representations and ultimately of memory, goes back to Lashley, probably. Carl Lashley is what, around the early part of the 20th century. There were probably predecessors. Lashley is very famous for that insight. Lashley studied lesion brains. So he was a neuropsychologist, as we would now say. And he actually had a rich supply of lesion brains from the First World War. It's quite macabre. In the First World War, there were a lot of soldiers wounded by gunshot wounds. And the gunshot wounds that people received at the time were localized. They didn't have these terrible munitions we have today, which totally blow up your body or brain. So a lot of people survived and had gunshot wounds. And he studied a lot of these people and was able to characterize the mental deficits that they suffered from these gunshot wounds. And one of his intuitions, we would not perhaps say that the evidence wasn't, absolutely rock solid, but in hindsight, it makes sense. He postulated that the serial order of items, events, and so on is a separate aspect of memory. So, for instance, some people might be able to recall the different things, the different events that are in a sequence, but they just get the order wrong. So that there's a difference in probability of error of in having recalling evidence that aren't the right ones or forgetting events compared to the probability of just switching them in their order. So the serial order was discovered as a separate aspect. That's what a lot of literature always points to as the insight that the sequential order, the serial order, is central. Another instance of seeing sequence, the ordering of events or actions as being in its own dimension is implicit sequence learning. So, for instance, you can have people perform, like even movements. There's a famous example from tracking. People do tracking movements. This was an old style, like 60s style, where you would have a display, and within that display, a line is moving in one dimension. You have to track it, and the line seems to. So it's actually a line in an underlying cylinder, but you only see through a slit the current position of that line, a black point that that moves around, and you have to track it. And so it seems to move randomly, and you always have a certain tracking delay to react to the changes in direction. And then unknown to the participant, particular portions of that seemingly random time course are actually reproduced a couple of times. And participants will then get better on that particular subset um, than on other subsets, even though they're not aware of it. It's implicit, but they will be improved, have improved performance on that. So they're somehow able to predict when the next turn is going to happen and the order of the different turns. So this is already a motor example. There's also there are examples where it's really categorical states, that the sequence of which you're implicitly learning, you're then able to predict what will be the next item. When you're looking at actions, timing is an important thing. That is, it's not just a question of the order, but also how long each event is, and how how much time elapses between the different events. And we'll get to that. That is, there's some subtlety about that. So for us, for dynamical field theoretical thinking, it's a fundamental challenge to understanding sequence generations. In fact, originally for a while, I argued that there's a missing concept and that we can't really deal with it. And that's because we postulate in DFT that all the functionally relevant neural states are stable states, attractors. And so attractors resist change, right? In a sequence, you need to change to a new state. And so the stability constraint and this change constraints are conflicting. And the answer, of course, is yes, the stability has to be lost. You have to have a systematic way of inducing instabilities to then get rid of that previous attractor and then go to a new attractor. And that's what we'll be talking about, how that actually happens. That's the core of the idea. So here's the survey of what we'll do. I'll introduce these ideas around the key idea is what we call the condition of satisfaction, COS. We'll come to that. I'll take an example to transmit the intuition. Then we'll talk a little bit about the more formal basis of that, a brief outlook at taking a more bird's eye view of that. And then we'll address, so the condition of satisfaction is about how you make an attractor unstable and get rid of it. And give me just a second. I just need to open the door for a moment.
That sounds actually okay, or should I? Yeah.
Second, I'll be right back. That's going to look funny in the video when it's break. Sorry. So somebody here needed to enter. So I'll then treat how when you have destabilized the current state, how you then actually select which state to go next to. And then we'll talk briefly about errors and failures, how to deal with that, and then look at a robotic demonstration of everything. Good. So here's this example that's historically also the example around which we developed these ideas. This was work that Julia Sandomilskaya did. I think I have the reference on the next slide. And so the notion here is that you ask an agent, here this is this little agent, to visit targets in a particular serial order. So here, for instance, you're supposed to first visit the blue target, and then visit the red target and then the green target, let's say. The vehicle actually just drives around, we'll see in a moment, until it finds the right target. And that entails, on the one hand, stabilizing that goal, stabilizing the target representation, like the color. And then when you see the target, really stabilizing it as a target for the vehicle that moves to this target, keeps the target as a stable representation. until it's done with the target, which means it's close enough to the target, and then switch to the next target in the sequence. And so this example was chosen because it has this challenge of motor systems like that, that it may take variable amounts of time to actually achieve a goal. So this vehicle actually just sort of makes a random search for the target. So it takes unpredictably long to achieve a target, and therefore, over that time, it needs to stabilize that goal. And then when it is, and while it does that, other targets that are also part of its repertoire but are not currently activated because they're not in the right position in the serial order, they need to be ignored. So they would be distractors. And then once they're done, they should switch to the next target. So this particular capacity to bridge different amounts of time and therefore to do a serial order task that is not just doing something at a fixed schedule, but that is really, keeping track of whether you have succeeded in any of the actions. That was this task really made it possible to focus on that. So here is a view of that task. So here, this is actually Julius Anamiska who's running this experiments here. On the left, you see how she teaches this little vehicle the colors, the serial order of the colors by showing objects of a corresponding color to the vehicle. And there's a subtle thing that if you look at it again, that every time she shows like the yellow block now, she actually moves it a little closer to the robot in the end, which triggers the robot to switch to the next sequence. And then on the right, she distributed initially the targets in the array, and then the vehicle is now moving toward targets in the correct answer order. For instance, first going to yellow, then red, green, and so on. It does that simply by doing obstacle avoidance, which doesn't work perfectly. As you see, it just collided with something. So it has some distance sensors and does obstacle avoidance. I teach how that works in the summer semester. And it has a vision system that I'll explain in a moment of how it is aware of these objects. For instance, here it's moving to this object and then it turns away when it's done with approaching that particular colored object. So this scenario really probes this performance that here, for instance, the vehicle ignores the red object, while here it really moves toward the red object, because this is when red is a target, while this is when red is a distractor. So how does that work? So the core idea in here is what we call the condition of satisfaction. We took this term from the philosophy of mind from Searle's analysis of intentionality. And next week, I will actually talk about the intentional agent that fully implements this Searlean program of intentions of different kinds. So for now, we just take this one term. And the notion is that if the robot has a certain intention here, that will mean some color that it wants to currently search. It represents that in what we call then an intention field. This would be field here over color, and this would be, for instance, let's say green, a peak at green, and that would define what its intention is. Then we would say there is a associated neural representation of what we call a condition of satisfaction. That is a representation of what would be the perceptual outcome if the goal had been achieved, the intention had been achieved. So here it's trivial in that it's also about color. So it's a field over the same dimension. And this field, the condition of satisfaction field, receives two inputs. One input is the prediction of what perceptual state would be the case when you achieve that intention. And that is here trivially the same color, right? So here it's a bit confusing. It's the same thing, but in general, it could be, of course, a different dimension, and there could be some non-trivial prediction here. So the prediction is if you're looking for green, then you will be having green on your perceptual surface. And on the other hand, there is some input from the actual vision system that might confirm or overlap with that prediction or not. And when these two overlap, this condition of satisfaction will fire, as we say, and that it will actually then inhibit something. This is an inhibitory connection. I'll explain that later, what exactly, and that will ultimately lead to that intention being deleted, and that's when it's done. So the way of how this is brought about is that the intention guides the visual cognition machine in the system. So it guides something like a visual search, where in the space color field peaks form under right conditions, and it drives the robot, which I don't explain here how that actually works, how it is able, if it knows in which direction an object lies, it is able to navigate in that direction. It's kind of like the Breitenberg vehicle, somewhat like that, can achieve that. And so we'll go through that a little bit to understand that. We have implemented different versions of that, so I'm mixing that actually a little bit just to illustrate, make the ideas concrete. So here's an example of the kind of visual input the system has. It has a camera image like this, a color camera. It's only interested in the horizontal spatial dimension. So all the vertical pixels are summed, added up, because it only wants to orient, it doesn't move up and down, it just orients horizontally to move toward target. So the representations we'll be looking at later have horizontal space that's expressed as an angular space as heading direction, and then hue, the color value, as a variable. The color, some technical way of how to extract from a color video different hue values. The intensity of that input that will control peak building in these fields, let's say, it's not the brightness of the scene, it's actually how many pixels are of the matching color. So we're extracting a color histogram over different colors here. And the strength at these different colors is how many pixels in every dimension, like here, this one, lie in that color. So for instance, here, yellow would have a lot of pixels. All these pixels would be yellow. White is actually discarded. All the background here is white is not considered a color here. So only the non-white objects actually enter into these histograms. So this histogram would be the sensory information about color from this particular position in space. And then you do that for all different positions in space. So here's the space in the sense of horizontal space color field that represents the combination of these two. Again, along color, you would have these entries, like this red thing here would be an entry that tells how intense the color is in the current visual array. And within that field, so a peak within that field would be localizing a colored object that is close. When it's close, it has a large vertical extent, so you get a large intensity. The ridge here would be the search queue. So for instance, if you're looking for this particular color, maybe it's yellow, you would activate all the spatial directions, all the heading directions equally. That's the kind of rich input you're familiar with. And the notion is then when the actual input from the visual array, like this red line, overlaps with that ridge, then this field may ultimately be able to build a peak and has detected an object of that nature. And while that's not the case, you have not detected a peak. So that is this very simplified version of what we call visual search in 2 lectures earlier when I talked about cued selection and high dimensional fields. When you have one more step. So that's just this representation, space color representation. You see here a ridge along color. This is rotated, so your space is now on the right and color on the left. And so this would be an example of building a space color peak here. Now, there are 2 influences on that, right? The one is that makes the ridge is the representation of which color you're currently looking for. So that will be this particular color. That makes the ridge. And the camera input, in the way I just sketched, makes these localized inputs. So for instance, the different objects you see here at different spatial locations make localized 2D inputs depending on the color that they have. I think this green one here might be. This one is a relatively large peak because it's relatively close. So a lot of pixels vertically that count for green, while maybe this other green object there in the back might be this smaller peak here, which doesn't have as many vertical entries and so on. So for the condition of satisfaction, this is the condition of satisfaction field, which we only owe a color, and it has 2 inputs. One is the predicted color, and if we're looking for this color, then the prediction would be that we build a peak at that matching color location. That input as such is a subthreshold. And then on the other hand, we would extract from the sensory representation, from this representation, a pure color representation. That would be the perception of the color that's dominant. So you project out space. You can actually go directly from the image and just look at all the color histograms and integrate out space, marginalize space, as we did. We called that contraction mapping earlier. And then there you might, if one of those is very large, you might have a large input at a particular color, and that you overlay here. And when that matches the condition of satisfaction, then you will get a peak here, and then the sequence of events will unfold. So here I have videos that illustrate this. This is the current intentional state of a color. Here is the 2D space field where you see the ridge and then some input forms, and ultimately there's a peak here. In the system, the condition of satisfaction is actually just a single neuron. It's a slightly different version where the different steps are actually separate fields here. So when the condition of satisfaction fires, there is here a peak forms. What then happens, it inhibits the current intentional state, and after that inhibition, the next intentional state arises. And I'll explain in a little while exactly how that happens. And so these are all synchronous videos. And so what you see is that whenever here the condition of satisfaction fires, there is this transition to the next peak. That's how the sequence then arises. And this consists of two things. It deletes the previous state. For instance, this will be deleted when the next peak is formed. And then something else arises, and that something else is based on a mechanism here. On a mechanism I still have to explain. So here's another cut through that system. And again, I'm mixing two different cases. One in which the ordinal system up here are fields, and another case where they are actually nodes. And that's the version that's ultimately published. So here's another view of this. So this would be your intention field. So your intention color. This is a long color. So you, for instance, currently have one particular color. And this is your condition of satisfaction field. And you see the prediction is this weaker input. This is now the color coding the activation level. So this is supra-threshold activation. This dark red, and yellow is sub-threshold activation. And now at this point, the condition of satisfaction is matched by input, and a real peak forms here. And that peak inhibits the intentional peak, so decays here. And now the intentional peak no longer provides this sub-threshold input to this layer. And as a result, this peak disappears. And then through some magic, another peak arises. Here, actually, another peak arises for another intention, and then also pre-activates the next condition of satisfaction. And I have to explain how that next thing is selected. And so this is a summary over an entire experiment like that. This was the training phase when Julia was presenting the individual objects. It looked somewhat periodic because she would show the objects. This is really from the robot, right? Show the objects somewhat reproducible amount of time. The color of the trace here is an indicator of what color was actually being shown. And so these little peaks here reflect what intention was extracted. This is over color space hue. And then during the actual sequence generation, the intention is represented here. I actually think it's this field. Oh no, this is the intention, yes. By the peak, for instance, oops, sorry. The peak up here and then there and so on. And these lines are where the transition happens, where the condition of satisfaction here detects that this color is now large, has a large representation on the sensory surface, and that inhibits the field, and the next peak arises, and then actually the condition of satisfaction itself becomes unstable, and then the prediction of the next condition of satisfaction happens. And so you see here that the amount of time that each step in that sequence takes can vary. And that's how, and it does not lose the stability of its intention while it is moving around, even though there could be in the visual array objects of a matching color to some future states it is looking at. But that doesn't actually, just as a distractor, doesn't actually perturb the stability of the intentional state. So that's what's achieved here. Now let's look why that works. What's the underlying neural or mathematical mechanism. So this is a very general notion, generalized from that example, where you would say you have some field over a dimension x within which you represent a current intention. So the intention would mean that you have a continuous of possible actions or goals, and they are spanned by this field. In other cases, this could be a multidimensional field or could be a stack of different fields across different dimensions. So one peak here selects one of these potential actions, and you have a second field that represents a condition of satisfaction, which in general would be over some other dimension y, or again, could be a whole stack of fields with different dimensions. And the intention predicts that outcome, and that is something that might entail a real transformation, some learned transformation. So in the example I just showed you, the dimension was the same. It was color, and the prediction is trivial, but there could be other cases where it's less trivial. For instance, if I grasp, then my prediction might be that I have certain haptic sensory information because I have the grasp, let's say, that I was going to grasp in my hand, and that's the prediction that you're going to do. You're going to say, I'm satisfied if I have that sensory signal, or if I have the visual feedback about the object being in my hand, or being, following the movement of my hand, or things like that. And then on the other hand, the intention itself can drive behavior. So it will ultimately bring about something in the world. And this example we just looked at, and I'll later argue it can also just drive something within the nervous system, could generate some neural state. And that neural state may match or not that prediction. And when it matches, it can bring that peak up, and then there would be inhibitory influence on the intention. So if we go through that step by step, then the notion is that the intention itself is a stable state. It will be generally sustained, as you don't, something causes this intention initially to come about, but we don't necessarily to have that input. So once we have stabilized intention, we can sustain it in the absence of input. And then that generates the subthreshold state from the prediction from the field, some projection. And then once you have sensory information or internal information about the outcome of your action, and it overlaps with this prediction, it would create a peak here. This would be a detection instability you generate here, and that would inhibit this entire field. So typically you don't need to know exactly where to inhibit. You would just inhibit the whole field, because if these are different dimensions, you don't want this back protection also to have to be learned to be predictive. You just inhibit the entire field, and therefore this peak would become unstable in the reverse detection stability. And as it becomes unstable, this input falls away, and you have to arrange that under those conditions, this peak will go through the reverse detection stability, so it will be gone. And so at the end, the intention and its condition of satisfaction are both gone. There's no peak anymore. And then what next happens is then up to the architecture to decide what comes next, and we'll discuss that as a separate topic. So we're using
Sorry?
Yes, please.
I have a question regarding the overall principle. For example, if the system knows that the second cue is green, for example, and on the way it encounters a green
Object.
located, or does it just randomly search after that again?
So I think you were blocked for a moment. I think you're asking if it says my internet connection is unstable. Let me check. Is that true? I apologize. There's some problem potentially. But you hear me again, right?
Yes.
Sorry, there must have been some fluctuation here in my internet. So I think you're asking if it encounters a object, for instance, a green object that occurs later in the sequence, if that would then have some effect on the system.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
Because, for example, if I think about a human in a maze, for example, and the human needs to collect balls in a specific color, and it encounters a green ball, but it doesn't need to collect it right now, you would still remember where it is located so you can go back to that.
Yeah, so that it would be clever, of course, yes. And no, this system doesn't do that. So this is, of course, a toy example just to show the
Mm.
core idea. So this system would really ignore the green. So here in this picture, that would say, let's say if this is red and then green is somewhere else here in this field, if you have an input here, it would not overlap with the prediction. It's not able to generate a peak, and therefore it doesn't affect, it doesn't inhibit anything. It's also not being stored anywhere else.
Mm.
And so this would be an example of what is sometimes called cognitive control. For instance, if you have a goal in mind and there are other things that you would also, that afford something that would be also perhaps inviting for actions, then you ignore them. This ignoring that requires some form of inhibition under some circumstances, and that's actually also a mental achievement. You might know that cognitive control is actually something that requires some kind of resource. In fact, for instance, frontal brain patients typically have a problem with that. There's a famous phenomenon that frontal brain patients will do what is called opportunistic activation. So if there is something that invites a certain action, like famously an open door in the hospital, somehow invites that you go through it, and they might lose track of what they were actually aiming to do and just react to that stimulus. And there are actually paradigms where you're manipulating that in the lab. For instance, a famous example is you have a table on which there are cups of different colors, and you tell the participant to take the red cup, let's say. And there is a green cup that would be not instructed. Then people are normally able to ignore that, and frontal brain patients sometimes will be attracted to that green cup if it is sort of on the way, if it's closer to the grasp than the red one. In fact, even a manipulation where it's a question of the handle being on the way to grasping or the handle not being in a good position. And they would have a certain probability of then taking the green cup just because it is conveniently positioned, and they sort of automatically activate it. And so that is something that we don't really model. Well, we model that you ignore that green cup, even let's say if it arises later in the sequence, but we're not really dealing with this detailed inhibitory mechanism. We do actually in other projects, and next we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, this activating another goal, opportunistic activation, is an interesting topic for us, and I'll actually also again talk about it a little bit next week about how goals arise, because usually the goals would be intrinsic, and somebody might instruct you, but still usually you have your own thoughts of goals, and goals could arise because there are opportunities to act on the goals. And that's one line of research we're interested in. What you're hinting at is that there might be other processes that are running in parallel, not acting on these objects, but for instance, building a scene memory. And that is true. And in fact, the example I'll show you next week does that. That is a system that does a different task, namely the task of building just a scene memory. And that task it would actually do generally. And the subtlety of attending to objects that are relevant to your later task, that is beyond what we currently treat. And it's thinkable that you would say, well, I'm more likely to store stuff in memory that plays a role later on, and that might very much be true for humans, even though perhaps not under every condition. So it opens a lot of different dimensions of behavior. Many of those are actually not treated in standard models right now. So it's a frontier of research. So again, we'll come to that a little bit next week. So far, we're not really dealing with that in detail.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
So, one thing that I now need to add is that this is not only a reasonable model for how you register that you're done with an action. When you're acting in the world, you can also be done with a mental act. A mental act might have that goal of bringing about something, but there's something that you bring about is an outcome in the brain, like creating the peak at the right location. And I did show you last week in this case of grounding, cases like that where we're trying to build a peak in the working memory. And when we have a peak there, and then we're done with that intention of creating the peak in the working memory, and we want to stop that process. And in that case, the predicted outcome is a neural outcome, and that could serve just as well as a condition of satisfaction. And so that's something that we're routinely doing. And the architectures I showed you last week actually do things like that, and we'll get a couple examples later today. That also works. So there can be some doubts, and I wasn't going to go into that in detail. If this works, because you could worry, if the time it takes to generate that signal, is that if it's too fast, it might even stop this before it's even grown because the outcome is already there. And all of this is actually, these kind of doubts can all be solved, and it's all based on the instability. So it's quite important to have these instabilities both here and there. Instabilities mean that you keep the state stable even if the inducing input is weakened, and so the bistability of these peaks, right? And that makes that this works. That is, even though you're weakening maybe already some intention, but once you're beyond threshold, you need less evidence to sustain any of these peaks than you needed to induce it initially, and that's how you avoid that a system turns itself off before it's even done, or before what it was intended to do is realized. Good. There is a theoretical challenge. I don't know if any of you are alert to that. Dale's law, right, says that something excitatory can't do inhibition. So, for instance, this detection stability requires self-excitation. So this is an excitatory field, but then it inhibits, right? That wouldn't be quite correct. And the answer is yes, this would be repaired by having inhibitory interneurons, so a second field that is inhibitory, and it would be that field that does the inhibition. And it doesn't really change anything. So this is like a simplification is to get rid of these inhibitory interneurons and just do it within one field. That's called adiabatic elimination of the inhibitory layer. And so that's fine. Just to say there's a cleanup of that's consistent with Dale's law. Good. So that's as much as I want to say about that mathematical mechanism. I'll next take a just very brief global perspective of that you might start to wonder about. Because globally speaking, globally meaning now, if you take, we have one peak, right? But if you look at one field, but if you think about the whole system as a big architecture of many fields, then it can't be globally in an attractor, because if it was globally in an attractor, then it would just stay in that attractor, right? So there must be some subsystems or some dimensions in which it's not in an attractor. And the vehicle is not in an attractor in the sense it is moving around, right? So if you take its position as a variable, the position is not in an attractor. Maybe its velocity is an attractor. Those who listen to me in the summer semester know that the heading direction dynamics is actually in an attractor. But its position isn't. It has a state in the world where it's position in the world, and in that position, it's in a transient. It's moving around, right? In this way, trivial case. But more generally, if you think about this, the dimensions that bring about the behavior as neural dimensions, like if it's about thought, then this must mean that there are some fields or some directions in activation space in which it's not an attractor, it's in a transient. For instance, it's building a peak somewhere in working memory, and that system that is building a peak there is not yet in the attractor, right? It's moving to an attractor, and that movement is a transient. So there must be some space in which that happens. There's a theoretician, is actually a physicist, Rabinovich, who formalized that idea. He calls that heteroclinic chain. And so that's the notion that there would be some directions in space along which you're an attractor. This is an illustration from his review paper where it's like a potential picture. So going downhill is going to the attractor. And then there are some other directions, like with respect to this attractor, this direction, along which it's on a transient. This would be called a saddle point. That is, if you're going to this attractor, then you would move to something else along this transient. And that creates, and if you do that, then you can run to some other attractor, and that attractor again has a dimension along which it is unstable, and that would lead to another transient and so on. So there will be a sequence of such transients, and this works because the directions, these so-called unstable manifolds, so the directions in which the system is unstable and moving toward a other attractor, that's a very small subset of the entire space. So the entire space is a very high-dimensional neural space in our language, continuously many dimensions for these fields. And then there's only just a limited number of dimensions in which these instabilities lie. And so the discourse that we have that the attractors organize the dynamics of the system are still true, and just that there are some special subspaces along which there are these instabilities. This very global view doesn't really help you to really understand exactly. I mean, this doesn't include the condition of satisfaction and an explicit neural analysis of this, but that's sort of why it works at all, right? There's always some dimension along which there is an unstable state. Remember, stability is a local property of a state, right? It's not a global property of the system. So all the attractor states that we're talking about have some unstable directions, and that then lead to the instability. And that's what the condition of satisfaction captures. Good. Ignore that. So now let's assume we now understood that a stable state becomes unstable through this condition of satisfaction mechanism. What will happen next? So which attractor are you running to next, right? In this Rabinovich picture, just abstract, you run into some direction. So this is actually a question that has been studied in psychology quite a lot. In psychology, typically people have not thought about this from a dynamical systems point of view, but from a computational point of view. They said, I have done something and now I'm computing the next thing. And there is a good analysis in the literature. There was a review paper already more than 20 years ago, almost 30, that summarized that state of the art. This is across very many different fields. And there is sort of a consensus that there are three basic mechanisms, all of which appear in different cases across very different kinds of behaviors, now from pure cognition to motor control and so on. And I'll step through these one by one. So one is called gradient-based selection, the other is called chaining, and the third is called positional, and that's actually the one we've been using. So let's talk first about gradient-based selection. So the notion in gradient-based selection is that that you have some activation variables. In the classical literature, it would be some form of input, and you're currently making one of those activation states unstable. That's the previous intentional state, and that then all the other potentially activated states are competing. They're inhibitorily coupled, competing for activation, and the state that has most input would win. So for instance, if you think of visual salience, then if you've gotten rid of your current peak of activation, the next salient input would win. The salient translating into highest input amplitude. In the example I just showed you, the next colored blob, let's say, that has is larger on the visual array, that will be the thing that wins. And that's something that we do in a lot of our models. For instance, the salience map, as I just hinted, would be of that kind. But it could also be based on more sophisticated computation where you would have some queue, like when you do queued selection, and the queue, so some objects might be queued and others not, and then you would be biased toward the queued objects. So it doesn't have to be bottom up. It can also, in that sense, be top down. So for instance, in some of our scene representation work that was implied in the perceptual grounding of language we did last week, there would be different locations where the inputs, and when you're selecting the next item, you would essentially, the location with most activation in such a representation would be the one that wins the competition. And the one particular trick you need is that the state that you just deactivated really needs to be suppressed, because that state maybe won a previous competition. So maybe it was the most salient object in the visual array. And now you may need to make sure that you don't select the same again, because it would be the most salient thing. And that's called inhibition of return. That is, you would have a neural representation of that previous state that you just finished. And that representation would inhibit this the field in which you're selecting, and so that previous state is then no longer the most salient state. There's a lot of empirical evidence for inhibition of return. This is more subtle if you look at it in detail. So I can't really go into that, but has been a lot of study of inhibition of return. There's a very good review article that's about 3 or 4 years ago by someone called Raymond Klein, who reviews all that evidence. And we built inhibition of return neural representations explicitly to address that. That is to avoid the system from redetecting the same state again. So that's an important component of making gradient-based selection of the next item a real functional idea. So I'm not saying more because the way this manifests itself varies, of course. Depends. Sometimes it's just one field within which competition takes place, like visual search within one spatial representation. But it could be sometimes, very different kinds of systems within which selections might happen and so on. So it's more complex. But this principle would always be the same, that the next state emerges from a competition, and then the most activated wins. So that's gradient-based. Now, the other notion is chaining. So chaining means that the current state that you just deactivated in some way points to the next state, and for instance, in the sense of having some synaptic connections, so that the next, so that item that gets, that will be the following item, gets some excitatory input, or does not get inhibitory input. Can do either excite or not inhibit. So that's a notion that for which there's good evidence in a lot of cases where there are fixed sequences. For instance, some of the motor behaviors are like that. For instance, when you reach, you open your hand and then close your hand as you approach the object, and that's temporal order, that you're opening as you're approaching and closing as you're when you're close, is fixed, and you can actually see it's really coupled. You can manipulate that by varying, for instance, the distance of the object to grasp surprisingly, and then you find that the opening of the grasp is coordinated with that. If you're slowing down the reach because you're moving the object away, then the opening of the hand also slows. And there would be potentially fixed operations like highly trained practical operations. You sometimes might find evidence for that when you fall into habits, like if you drive home, or if you do some routine thing that you fall into that sequence. There will be a notion that could be due to chaining. That is, the current state points to the next state, pre-activates the next state. So it's not very flexible. It has one famous problem, that if you have a certain state, then the next state is determined by that current state. So when the current state has multiple possible successors, that cannot really be represented. Like in the sequences I just showed you in the toy example, if you have a blue object that is followed by red, and then later in the sequence you have a blue object is followed by green, that cannot be represented because blue just points to red and it can't also point to green. And actually in the examples that we used here, that was really the case. We had here that I think there were two reds here. So one red followed by green, and another red. Actually, it's followed by something else. Unfortunately, I haven't really. I thought it was represented somewhere here. Here. You see, red is followed by, there is a blue that's followed by green, and there's a blue that's followed by yellow. And the system can do that, but with chaining, you wouldn't be able to do that because the blue neuron, let's say, would excite the green, and if it also excites the yellow, then the sequence is no longer uniquely determined. There's some workarounds, like having two copies of the blue, one for one sequence, on the other. You see the kind of trouble you get, but that's a limitation. Still, there is, for instance, a notion that in the speech articulatory system, you have chaining. That is, there are certain automatic sequences where a certain articulative configuration is followed by another because it predicts what will happen. This is sometimes observed as co-articulation, that you're already taking into account what will come next. as you're pronouncing one part, so as to facilitate that. So there is certainly, even in higher skills, there is this sort of chaining idea. So we're using chaining, and you saw that in some of the slides that I didn't explain, when we're imposing some sequence order, and the idea, of course, it would be ultimately learned. The way we typically do it for more or less technical reasons is double inhibition. For instance, here is an example of a sensory motor system that would have intentional nodes, condition of satisfaction nodes. Now this excites and this inhibits. And then the notion is this particular behavior would inhibit what we call a precondition node. And that precondition node inhibits another behavior, the intention of another behavior. So while that precondition node is active, this cannot be activated. And only when this is done would it inhibit this precondition node and therefore release this from inhibition. And then this one can be done. And that imposes a certain form of sequentiality. That's like chaining. And the cool thing about that is you can actually regulate that by activating these precondition nodes or not. So if you have a lot of these precondition nodes by top down, activating some of them, you can sort of fix which sequence you're currently trying to achieve, like in a motor system. And this sort of double inhibition is actually the organizing principle of the basal ganglia. So you might know some basal ganglia have this feature that they inhibit a lot of downstream actions, and you can select an action by disinhibiting that action, and then it will follow. Yeah. And the last is the positional representation of serial order. It's the most subtle and the most flexible, and that's actually the system that Julia used. So in that, that sort of combines chaining with learning. So the notion is you have a chaining system, but the chaining system are some neurons, we call these ordinal neurons, that represent just where in a sequence you are, and what you do at that point in the sequence is something that you express by neurally connecting to some other representation. So here will be the example. For instance, this is one way to do that. This would be the neuron that first is activated, and it has a memory unit this is sustained activation. So even if this neuron is off, this one still will be on. And that memory unit pre-activates the successor of that neuron, and that activates its memory, and that activates the successor, and so on. So you have a system like that, and you make sure that all these nodes here compete. So only one node along the ordinal axis here to the right will be the ordinal axis that represents order. Only one of them can be active. So for instance, currently this one is active and no one else can be active. And if you now inhibit this entire system, going through the reverse detection, and then release the system from inhibition, the competition that, using gradient based would be now activating this unit, because this one gets input from the predecessor. So this one would become active. So that's a way to do chaining. And that chaining becomes flexible by each ordinal unit projecting onto some feature space that specifies the action. Let's say in the example would be color. And it would do that by having learned that when this is active, you're going to do this color, and with this active, you're doing that color, and so on. That's concretely how Julia organized that system. That is, the action field was over color, and in the training phase, this neuron was activated by the sequence of presenting something to the stimulus. The condition of satisfaction that is engaged there switches this system around. So when you have one system active, there's a color that's currently visible to the robot, and that color makes a peak here, and then heavy learning connects this node to that color. And that's how you would know what the contents of that particular step in the sequence, let's say step number 2 in the sequence is. And then that system is more flexible. That is, you could now have that the same color is pointed to from different parts in the sequence, right? You could have that node. I didn't put an arrow like that, but that node could potentially project to the same color than, let's say, that node. So you don't have that problem of needing a unique successor state to a particular content. for example, for the color. So this is actually the architecture that was finally used in this toy system. So there was an ordinal system up here that selects one item, one particular ordinal position, and that projects onto the contents, which would be this color. The color drives the motor system through the environment. You might achieve that color, and from the same perceptual representation, you drive the condition of satisfaction representation that would be getting this predictive input from the intention. And when that peak forms, it inhibits this entire system. As it inhibits that system, these projections here stop working. Therefore, this peak goes away, and because of this pre-activation, this here goes away, and therefore there's a release from inhibition. So when you release from inhibition, this system forms again a peak, just globally recovering from inhibition, and the peak will be formed at the successor, that is where the working memory of where you last were is released from inhibition, gives a little input, and that will be the peak that wins there, and that creates the next peak here, and that drives the action, and so on. That's how that system really works. So that's positional. Good. And in fact, we're currently using this as a way of counting. So I only hinted last week that we're using these indices, right? Where we're giving object number 1, object number 2, and so on, an index, and we're binding through index. We're saying the first thing we talked about is the argument of a certain relation. And the second thing we talked about is an argument of something else. And for that, we need to associate a object, for instance, with a particular ordinal position. And essentially, it will be a system like that running, and where you're along this dimension, that will be the index. So this will be a concrete case where you have 4 nodes, and this will be the 4 indices, and you'd have to activate them in sequence. For instance, as your attention is selecting objects in the scene, you're each time increasing that counter every time you end your fixation on an object, you inhibit and switch to the next index, and so on. And we're just working on really combining these ideas, putting this into the language grounding system. Good. So this is all about just learning a single sequence, right? When you have this, there's one ordinal system that projects onto a particular contents, and we actually don't really have a general solution for how to learn multiple such systems, and this is a problem. There's some work on hippocampus being like that. Hippocampus there's some evidence for stuff like that in hippocampus, sometimes called pre-play. So in hippocampus, you have certain sequences that can be observed when the animal is behaving. It usually means it walks around in a labyrinth, and you have replay, that is, an animal is not behaving, but is, for instance, sleeping or sort of drowsy, and you see the same neural sequence happening where people think it's sort of rehearsing the sequence it experienced. But you also have pre-play, that is, before it ever even navigates in the environment, you already see sequences of neural states that are later going to show up in the context of behavior. And the notion is that there's some fixed circuitry like that does these sequences, and that circuitry learns to associate the different stages in the sequence with particular behavioral states, like particular locations in space. And my colleague Sen Sheng, his group is actually studying things like that with most of his much more complex architectures. So that could ultimately lead to so each of those sequences is sort of a map effectively, and you would have to be able to build multiple maps and so on. So that's the whole area. So last new content matter, I'll then show the demo, is to think through what happens if you're not satisfied, if you don't achieve the condition of satisfaction. And that actually connects to a old and deep problem in cognitive psychology. I want to distinguish 2 cases. They are related, but so one the more tricky case is if you're trying to achieve a certain action and nothing happens. That is, you're not you're not getting the output you're predicting, but it's not like you're getting a alternative output that you didn't like. So in the field that you're looking at, let's say color field, nothing happens, just nothing happens. And then we'll come to the other case. So here's an example. So for instance, this is a case that's known as the problem of same responses. And this is actually a common case in a lot of reaction time task and sort of like change detection for working memory. So for instance, in working memory, very often you show participants a particular array, like these 3 items here, and then you have a delay, and then you show a different item, and they have to say, was it the same or different? So this will be a case where it's different because this brown is replaced by a green. And it was the same, it would be that array that is being shown again. And now you have to say same or different. Different. And you can see it's maybe potentially easier to get a different response because you have some real difference to detect, while same is like detecting that nothing, there's no change, right? So for instance, here's a model that we did a couple of years ago of change detection. And we would have a working memory activation field that's coupled to inhibit, it's a 2-layer field, activation, inhibition. So if you have an item working memory here, it would create that inhibitory item, and this is self-excitatory. That will be your memory of the item that you generate when you first see the item you generate by perceiving that item that induces this peak. And because of this shared inhibition, this inhibition would also actually inhibit this perceptual layer. The perceptual peak will go away or be suppressed. So if you remove the perception input, there will be no peak standing here because of this inhibition from the inhibitory field. That's sort of a common model of change. This is just actually explains how the working memory is built. Now, how that does change detection is illustrated here. Let's say if you have in this memory 3 peaks for 3 items, let's say along color, or this is black and white, but it's supposed to be a color peak. You have this color and the 2 other colors that are close to each other, and they inhibit, each of these peaks inhibits this perceptual layer. So there's a trough here and a trough there. And if you're now presenting a new item that has a different color, and it's not different, mean it's not in this trough of inhibition, then it has a chance to build a peak, and that will be the event where you detect the change, and that would drive a different response. So for instance, a different response could be a particular neuron that any peak here projects to, and then you give a different response, self-excitatory, and you say, difference. Now, the same response, this is the problem, right? The same response would be just the absence of any peak here. Like if you're showing the same item again, the input is on top of a trough, so this does not build a peak. The input doesn't build a peak because it is inhibited. And so now you have no event, nothing. How do you say this is same? And the notion is that that's your default response. That is, you're always activating the same. You would activate it concretely when you give this go signal that you're showing the whole scene. Then you have to start the clock in a sense. And the notion would be that the same unit is self-stabilizing, and it will go on once you present this test array after some time. I haven't explained how timers like that work. They're active transients, so they take a certain amount of time to build a peak, and then the peak will actually decay spontaneously. And so that would take some time for that peak to form, and that time for the peak to form can be interrupted by the difference response. So if you get the different response, it inhibits this response, and therefore you're only going to say different. But if this does not come, this difference response, then you're going to go same. And so that's the notion that you're saying same, or not matching or not detection, just because you're timed out. You didn't get what you predicted, and then you're going to give up at some point. You might be familiar with the variant of that of a much more macroscopic timescale. For instance, if you're looking the famous these games like in newspapers, sometimes you have to detect the difference, right? Two images and they differ in some way. You go back and forth and try to find places where the images are different. And when you find a difference, it's because you're going back and forth, and there is some comparison that leads to a different response. But if can you ever be sure that you have found them all? So when are you going to say there is no difference anymore? I mean, sometimes you're being told there are 7 differences, and you keep trying. Perhaps if you don't know that, how do you stop? And the notion is you stop by timing out. At some point, you give up. You say it's not going to. There's no response like that, and that is sort of a common account. Very typically, same responses or these non-detection responses take longer, and they have a different distribution of reaction times. That's consistent with this kind of model. So we're using essentially a neurodynamic version. I didn't explain exactly how this timer property works. The timer property where one neuron that is surely going to be activated on a long time scale can be interrupted by another neuron. And so the default response is the timeout response. That's how we solve that problem. So that's fundamental in the sense that very generally in life, in cognition, the absence of a result isn't really a signal. So the absence of result ultimately means you give up on something just because you've tried long enough. You can imagine that in a very macroscopic scale, you could give up, studying something, or you could have attempting to open a box or various kind of activities. And there is a chance I'll come back to that next week about how to represent very long times. Like if you try for years to study and you fail, how do you actually keep that goal going for such a long time and then deactivate it ultimately? And there's of course more to be said than just this one thing, but you can see it's a very general problem, how to end something based on no specific sensory input for that. Contrasted to all the change or difference or match responses where you're ending something because a condition of satisfaction was actually observed. So we call that the condition of dissatisfaction when we have this timeout. So this is just the words what I just said written down. It's easy. The easier case if there is a outcome, and it just doesn't match in terms of contents. So again, outcome just means that at the time, so when you're instantiating your intention, that after that, so as a consequence of that, some signal arises, and that signal is in a state that in the same field or in the same set of fields, it's just not metrically correct. So here's an example of how this so-called mismatch detection might work. And that's sort of the generalization of sort of integrates these two kind of things. Let's say you have an intention. This would be your prediction. I'm looking for an item of a certain kind, and I'm predicting it would be this particular feature, like something yellow, let's say. And this is the feedback from the scene, the feature that you're actually intending. So if they match, then this would mean that this peak is at the same location as that peak if it's the same feature space. And so we would say, well, if I detect a peak here and I detect a peak there, then I'm ready to decide either if it matches or not. So this peak here activates both the non-match node and the match node, because that's the kind of situation when I want to decide. And now you have a mismatch detector. That is, what you're doing is you're adding one of these excitatorily and the other inhibitorily. So if they match, they extinguish each other or cancel each other. There's no peak formed. If they do not match, a peak is formed. There will be this mismatch detection. And so you're using this mismatch you get a peak here, and that peak would then drive the non-match response. So the condition of dissatisfaction is now really determined by something that you can detect, by a mismatch you can actually detect. While in this case, the match response, the same response, is again the default response. So if it's not interrupted by the condition of dissatisfaction, then the match response will go active. So it just notices there's a peak here, there's a peak there, that will make the match response the same response. And if it's not interrupted by a mismatch, then it will say it's matches. So here, this is called conditional satisfaction, and that conditional dissatisfaction, even though it's sort of the opposite of what we just did, but so this is the default response, and that's the interrupt the mismatch response. And so that's when you actually have a signal for the mismatch, then you can do that. And so that's something that we routinely use in our field. So the visual search architecture, for instance, does that by checking if the item that you now selected actually matches or mismatches. In visual search, it turns out that people are routinely looking at a lot of objects that are not perfect matches, so candidates, but they're not so strict to only allow peaks to form that totally match your prediction. That would be probably very unstable or not robust, because you can't have very precise selection like that. So you're allowing a few more things to filter through and then discarding them by mismatch detection until you finally get a match. Good. Yeah, there was in this earlier paper that I flashed last week, we had a explicit representation of the conditional dissatisfaction rather than a timeout, which we're now interested in because what does it mean to be not to the right of something? It's actually not the same as being to the left of something, right? You could be above and below. It's also not to the right. And so we don't believe that there's an explicit representation like that. And it's actually an interesting research topic. We had a paper last year, Cognitive Science, about representing like negation, how to deal with so-called polarity. If I say something is not the case, what does that mean? And that's not the same as a condition of dissatisfaction. Okay, now last point to show you in a robotic example how all that works. I'm just using this example to illustrate a bit how that concretely shows up in an architecture. It is sort of the deluxe version of the Julia experiment, the robot that drives. This is a robot that points. This is the overall architecture. It has this serial order machine that I was just hinting, where one neuron represents the first step, second step, third step. Each has a memory unit that activates the next one. They point to color. It's also something with color. There's a whole scene representation system that is similar to the thing that we referred to in perceptual grounding and visual search. And there's actually a movement architecture that actually moves the arm. It uses a neural oscillator. I didn't really explain that. Moves the arm a little. And has a representation of the target, and it detects whether you're done with the movement. So this is correspond to the vehicle moving. Here you're detecting whether your arm is at the location that you want it to be. So there will be the system detects whether the position matches the position that you're aiming at, the target position. And if your position matches target position, then you're done. You've achieved the reach that you want, and going to fire that, and then you're going to switch to the next, and so on. So here a little bit scenario. So you're showing this robot colors in a particular sequence, and the camera here looks at this part of the surface. This is what the robot sees, and that they're showing up these transients, that things appear and disappear. That is the teaching signal that tells it the sequence of colors, and then you let the robot, you distribute these objects in space. And then the robot is supposed to point at them in the order in which you taught the colors. And this pointing, is a real action that takes some time to be done. It actually only points vertically. You see, to be vertically on top of the color. It doesn't actually do the touching it or anything. And it's done in a simulator. So that's actually the sort of the deluxe version of what Julia did here. It's not a random search, it's a visual search for the object. And we can then do subtle manipulations, as I'll show you, about the actual behavior. So here's how a sequence in the training, how this sequential learning happens. So for instance, here you're showing it a green object at this point in time, and you're activating the first order node is active, and this is how now, when this green object has been detected, the peak at green is formed, and now you're learning the weights, synaptic projection from this first ordinal node to a particular color that traces laid down. So this indicates that there is some synaptic weights have connected green to ordinal node number 1. That's why the ordinal node is shown here in green, just to remember that. And there's actually a detector that triggers now the event that tells the system to switch to the next event. That's an offset detector. That is the signal that tells the system that we're done with this. This disappears, and then it's a blank case, and then we're showing the next object. And from that disappearance makes that the offset detector here was inhibited. The offset detector now gets activated. So it's offset is some neural mechanism of how something that was activated was inhibited, is released from inhibition, creates a peak there where something changed. These kind of, I used to have this in this lecture discussing all the transient detectors and active trends and so on, but I skipped this year. So it's just some other flavor, a little bit of excitatory inhibitory fields, which together can make these little transient signals that gives can be used to detect events and create discrete moments in time from continuous time stuff. This changes the counter. So now we're looking at the ordinal position 2. The ordinal node, the condition of satisfaction 1 was done, and the ordinal of 2 is active, which ends up being blue. And so we're building the peak at the blue location. The color blue is extracted, and now it's learning to associate this blue color with the ordinal position 2, until again the blue is removed, the offset detector fires, and then we're showing the third object, which is a third color, and then it learns to associate that third one. So after it's done that, it can then act. Actually, this is first showing how attention selection helps to build a scene memory. So this is building actually a scene memory in sequentially. Here it first looks at this object just based on actually it's random selection. The camera looks a little bit slanted, so this is slightly larger, so it will tend to look at the objects at the bottom first and then goes to the objects a little bit further back. So it's based on seance, it selects this first, extracts this color. This is its working memory, color over 2D space. And so as it brings in this color peak, that makes a slice input into this 3D layer. And you see where it intersects with the currently selected location. It creates a little peak here, this little red thing here, that's a peak in 3D at that location. And then it detects that it's done with that peak. That's not shown here, the condition of satisfaction for that here, which means now it does the next selection. The next selection is here, this item that is a little larger than the one on top. So it connects that, extracts its color, which is blue, and then it creates here, it's this peak, creates a peak where this blue slice intersects with the positional slice, and that's its item in memory. And when the condition of satisfaction comes, it deletes that, and then ultimately will select the one on top. Now that's again a sequence that's condition of satisfaction, intention, alternating like that. You see the intention state is on until it's ended by the condition of satisfaction, and then the condition of satisfaction, the intention state dies, condition of satisfaction dies, and then the next state comes up. That's here by chaining that we just count the ordinal system up. So see, this is an intention to build working memories, right? There's no action in the world. It's just internal of which peak it selects, and then it builds a peak in the working memory. This would be an example of a purely mental sequence of events where it puts one item after another into working memory. And 2 lectures back or so, we looked at the sequence of events when you're building a working memory step by step, and that is actually the mechanism that underlies that. It uses conditional satisfaction. Yeah, and then here last, it acts out. So it now gets these 3 objects in these 3 locations. It has learned that action number 1 is green. So when action number 1 is required, this will be the target. It's looking for green, and then it will, essentially a visual search type, activate that green target. That position is given to the arm. The arm is moving there, and this is the position match. This is the position of the arm. This is of the target. When they overlap, it will detect that it's done. It has reached that position. This fires, and that switches. The system makes the condition of satisfaction. Then the next, the green intention goes down, and the next ordinal node, the blue one, becomes activated and is retrieving from its memory that second item is blue, and now it selects the blue target and then again moves to the blue target. When it's done with that, conditional satisfaction fired, the next neuron comes up, which is pink apparently, and then it again finds, activates pink as a cue and finds the pink target and moves to the pink and so on. That's how it acts this out. And the amount of time again would depend, for instance, on how far the target is. This is faster than that, and so there are different amounts of time that are needed for each action. You see that this period where you're looking for going to blue is shorter than this one or that one. And now, and this is an interesting subtlety. Shows that it's not just, a complicated neural way of doing something that you would write down as a periodic phenomenon, which just move from step to the next. So it shows that at any time you're still connected to sensory input. So here the system does the same sequence. I think it's green, blue, and pink. And so it first moved to green, and next it moves or wants to move to blue. So at this point, its target, I think here, they selected the blue as a target. This will be this blue is selected as a target. And just as it does that, we make the target jump. So the target was here, and then we just move the target in the visual array to a new location. And this means that the system will shift, the ongoing, the cue is the same, and ongoing, the input to the target representation in a visual search style will shift to the new location, and the old one will decay. It will actually also correct its working memory of that, but currently it's still in the working memory, it's still in the old location. And so the system will automatically adjust the target. We call that online updating, and then move to the new target. And this is an example where it then really takes longer to go to the blue target because it first moves in the old direction, then that makes a correction movement, and then ultimately achieves the blue. So this shows, where it's so to be able to do this, to react to a change in the environment while you're going for a target, that's where you critically see that you need to keep the intention stable until you're done. It wouldn't be enough to just go to the location and now switch to the next target. That's where the sensory motor continuous coupling to sensory input is critical. It might not be easy to follow that so quickly, but that sort of mess can retain that as a message. Okay, so that's what we did today. And so I conclude by saying that these principles that we have, that the localist representations create stable states, and they can become unstable in a controlled way, hereby going through this detection, the reverse, and two reverse detections, right, in one transient that gives the self undoing of an intentional state, and that enables the autonomous generation of sequences of mental acts and actions. You see that's critical to get toward higher cognition. As I illustrated already not last week, all of that was done autonomously with these kind of ideas. So next week I will show how that generalizes. I'll show how these kind of intentional states, we call them intentional states, but actually really think about what that means, and we'll see that these kind of intentions cover a lot of things that we consider usually actions or planning or mental things. And we'll also see that there are neural states that are of a different nature, that are, we'll say, of a different direction of fit. And I'll explain what that means. And they have different time structure. And these other states are more like perceptual kind of states. Those are the ones that are modeled by most neural networks. Well, the ones that we're looking at is in the direction of it. We call that world to mind. That's the one that's really what we intuitively mean by people having goals and going some places that are not driven by input. And that also will point to our research frontier, which is to get our systems to have goals, to have real true intentions, to truly autonomously act toward goals and select ultimately the goals themselves. And we have only limited success, but we're currently working, for instance, on opportunistic goal selection in very simple toy examples. So that will be the last lecture we'll do next week, which will be a short lecture. And then I'll also use this to discuss a few general points.